Eye on the Storm, Hurricane Season 2019.
And good evening and welcome to week 3 of Eye on the Storm, your weekly in-depth look at the tropics and how it will impact you. It's 8 o'clock on the East Coast, and I'm CBS 17 Chief Meteorologist Wes Hohenstein here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Thank you so much for stopping by. We're going to talk a lot about what's going on in the tropics. We're going to be joined by meteorologists in Savannah, Georgia, and up in Richmond, Virginia over the course of tonight's show, each offering a different perspective as to their experiences, stories they can tell about the tropics, and things you may not know as we are almost 1 month into the hurricane season. But before we jump into that, I'd like to ask you guys watching at home, I know a lot of you might be watching on a device or on a laptop, if you have any questions about anything in the tropics, both for tonight and topics that maybe you would like us to cover in the coming weeks, please reach out to us on Facebook and Twitter. Our digital teams are monitoring questions. They'll pass them along to me and the rest of our team as we go throughout the night. Here in Raleigh, I'm Weather Wes Hohenstein on Facebook. When we go down to Chris in Savannah, Georgia, she's WSAV Chief Meteorologist Chris Allred, and John up in Richmond is ABC 8 News WRIC. With that, let's jump into what's going on now, because guess what? We actually have something to talk about. You know, on the Atlantic side, things continue to look relatively calm. Here's a look at the satellite picture, and this time of year, as most of you know, we generally see tropical activity form in the Gulf of Mexico, in the western part of the Caribbean, or down around the Bahamas. And all three of those areas, I mean, barely have any clouds. Be a good time to go vacationing down there. Later in this season, we'll start to look farther out to sea for things to develop, and there's really nothing going on out there. So all's quiet. And those of you up and down the East Coast know that haven't had a lot going on weather-wise the past few days. That's because strong ridge of high pressure kind of keeping a lid on everything. That looks to be the case for the next couple of weeks, but that is not the case on the other side of the United States. Let's go over to the Pacific side, because we have a little activity you can see across the intertropical convergence zone, but this little bank of clouds, that little swirl, is our first tropical storm of the Pacific season, and it is Tropical Storm Alvin. It's got 45-mile-per-hour winds. It's moving west at 14 miles per hour, and it looks to remain a tropical storm over the course of the next several days, not intensifying into a hurricane before weakening as we head into the weekend, and more importantly, not impacting any weather across the southwestern part of the United States or across parts of Mexico. The flow might actually throw them some extra clouds and whatnot, but nothing significant is really going to impact them. And remember, the Pacific side has an entirely different set of names than the Atlantic side, so their Alvin is not our Alvin. Remember, we had Andrea already. That's an entirely different set of names. I wanted to throw this at you. This is the almost the latest, only 1969, there it is, and 2016. So there have only been 2 other years that had a later first name storm formation in the eastern Pacific Ocean. So this is rare that it took this long to get to the first name storm on the Pacific side. Let's come back to the Atlantic, because before we get to our first guest tonight, I want to talk about one of the things that's keeping things calm in the Atlantic right now. And this is African dust, Saharan dust. We actually have a forecast product that can tell us what dust from the deserts of Africa that gets thrown up into the atmosphere and then dragged across the Atlantic, that can actually hinder any tropical development. You get that warm, dry dust up into the atmosphere, and it kind of changes things. It prohibits a lot of tropical activity from forming. So I want to show you this forecast product that is pretty much going to ensure we make it through all of June. Remember, we had Andrea back in May, but we haven't had any named systems in June. This is going to show you why we're probably not going to have anything, because we take it from where we are right now Wednesday night. Again, this is a forecast product, so I'm going to go out to Friday, Saturday, Sunday, through the weekend, through early next week. And what I want you to notice is, I'm not going to stop it and pinpoint an exact day, but notice what the trend is. There's a lot more dust coming off the African coast, getting pulled across the Atlantic, and anywhere you see that enhanced yellow is where we could have some extra dust up in the atmosphere, and that's going to do a really good job of keeping things from forming. All right, that's a cool map, but this is probably an even cooler shot. How about a live look at Sandbridge Beach up near Virginia Beach, of course, in Virginia, and that is where we are headed next. John Bernier is the chief meteorologist at WRIC in Richmond, Virginia. John, you just heard me talk about Saharan dust, but you've got another great indicator that we can all look to help determine what kind of tropical activity we could see here on the East Coast. Take it away from Richmond.
And that's right. We are going to talk about rainfall in Africa. I've actually got my dust product up right over here on the other side of me, that way, to kind of show you what's going on. And it is kind of interesting. And by the way, a lot of people don't realize if we go back all the way to 2003, when we talk about Hurricane Isabel, which was a devastating hit for the Outer Banks and also up especially into the eastern portions of Virginia, it was dust from Mexico that fed into that storm and actually kind of put the kibosh on it and weakened it, because you got to remember it was going into the Bahamas. It was actually a Category 5 storm, so dust can be good at kind of mitigating the effects of tropical weather. All right, with all that, by the way, going on, let's go to the big board and tell you there's our African dust product that we happen to have. And just one other thing I want to toss out while we're here, there's a lot of dust from Africa actually flowing northeastward. It's called the Spanish plume right now, that's been flowing up into portions of Europe. And if you haven't been paying attention, there has been all kinds of record heat set from Madrid to Paris, over to Berlin, into portions of Poland, even in the Czech Republic. And of course, remember, those of you who are football fans, big match coming up on Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock, the USA versus France in the quarterfinals. And Paris tomorrow may set an all-time record high temperature. They could see temperatures around 41 degrees Celsius, which is almost 106 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's one of the influences of what's going on with that dust right now. It's helping to create that huge heat wave that's ongoing over in the European regions. All right, but let's talk about the other factor that plays in here. This is daily rainfall in May, the average of daily rainfall in portions of Africa. Now, we think of northern Africa as the Sahara Desert, but just when you get below that, you get into an area that actually gets very wet, and that can be a key factor in the development of these waves that come off of Africa. These little disturbances get out in the Atlantic Ocean, and when the conditions are right, they just explode into these long-lived tropical systems. So this is the rainfall outlook from Africa for the summertime. And again, these areas right here, we're looking at Western Sahara, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, and Mali, and showing above average rainfall, likely also back to the east, a little bit drier, and then below average right down the south, right along the coastline. And some of these places, you don't think of it, they actually get really good amounts of rain. So, for example, in Bamako, Mali, and of course, if anyone ever tells you to, go to Timbuktu, it's in Mali, by the way. We get into the summertime, we're talking, they get 11 inches of rain. We get into August, July, we get 8 inches of rain, 7 inches. And remember, late August and into September, that's when we start seeing the peak of hurricane season. So this moisture, as it evaporates, can become systems that develop into storms that form off the African coastline and work their way to the west. Same story if we come out here over to areas and we get into Conakry over in Guinea, and look at these rainfall amounts in July and August. Boy, I tell you, this is basically Seattle's yearly rainfall twice. Just 1 month's worth happening twice, basically what you get out in Seattle in an entire year. So when this area gets really wet and above normal, the area is called the Sahel, S-A-H-E-L, it can be an indicator of more active Atlantic hurricanes, especially the ones late in the season when we get into August and September. These storms that start forming after August 24th, that's really about when everything just starts to kick in a high gear. And look at all these long track storms. Fran back in 1996, everybody in Raleigh remembers Fran for what it did to you. Of course, that was the second storm that season hit Wilmington. And then, of course, we've got Isabel, 2003. Irene formed actually down here by the Windward Islands and then came up through, but kind of a same type year. And then Florence last year, which is a little more of a northern path for the storm, because it came, looked like it was going to turn, get dipped down to the south. The other thing to notice is look at where all these storms, these specifically, passed in relationship to Puerto Rico. There's kind of a little doorway around Puerto Rico. We've got these storms coming across that we watch heading up in our direction here. So this could be a real big indicator of what's happening out here. The rain that's out in Africa can be a very big indicator of the likelihood of storms that form out. We used to call them the Cape Verde storms, but now they're referred to as Cabo Verde, which is the correct name for the islands. Long track storms across the eastern portions of the Atlantic, coming to the western Atlantic, and eventually turning and affecting us here. So that can be, Wes, maybe a very big indicator of the potential for these storms possibly affecting us and possibly affecting the eastern seaboard.
Yeah, you know, John, it's amazing that African dust, rainfall over there can impact what's happening an entire ocean away. You mentioned Irene and Fran. You know, we're 20 years now removed from Floyd. You guys, one of your maybe top 5, top 10 worst hurricanes ever. 15 years ago, Hurricane Gaston, right? Do you remember that one?
Yeah. Gaston created tremendous localized flooding downtown Richmond. If you've ever come through Richmond, you see where the Science Museum of Richmond is. There was a foot of rain that fell in that afternoon. Now, the areas that were actually affected, it's a narrow bullseye over Virginia. It's not as widespread as the effects, for example, from Isabel and Irene, which were the 2 worst storms to affect us here. Absolutely the 2 worst storms. And then the derecho back in 2012, which is going to be 7 years ago this Saturday. Very localized effect, but just the dramatic pictures from it when low-lying areas, Shockoe Bottom, which is a restaurant entertainment district, you had water that was 7-8 feet high. Wow. You can search for it on YouTube, look for a place called Bottoms Up Pizza. You can actually see the security video of the water and everything rising inside that location.
Wow. John, you've been there 35 years plus now up in Richmond, right?
Yes, 35 years, sir.
Wow, so you remember a lot of those. Some great resource if you're ever up in the Richmond area. John, you also were talking to me earlier today about some very interesting tornado climatology related to when hurricanes, because that's one of the many things we have to worry about when hurricanes are coming inland is tornadoes.
Yeah, this was actually, and I'm popping the graphic up here, this was a study done by Ethan Rogers, who is a student at Penn State University, and he kind of created a tornado index to show basically the threat from tornadoes, and he used not necessarily the amount of tornadoes that occur, but a variety of factors, you know, what time of day they occur, the housing infrastructure, also the population density. Because you remember, when you go out someplace, when you get into western Kansas or you get into western portions, Oklahoma, western Texas, population density is much lower than, for example, in the Triad where you are. And he actually, by doing some of this research, found out that some areas, for example, around Washington, D.C., have as great a threat of tornadoes as they do down in portions of Dallas, Texas. There's a neat little graphic, and this was a story that ran on the Capitol Weather Gang on Washington Post yesterday, actually showing portions of North Carolina down here south of Raleigh have a tornado threat when you put all these factors together, very similar to what you see in Oklahoma and even in Virginia. We've got one area there that's in the real dark red. It happens to be the city of Petersburg, where back August 6, 1993, you had the strongest tornado recorded in Virginia, which was an F4 with 200+ mile-an-hour winds hitting there, killing 3 people in a Walmart and another person over in the next town of Hopewell. But 200+ mile-an-hour winds, Old Town Petersburg, which had survived the Civil War, these buildings that were very sturdily built, brick buildings, just being absolutely devastated.
Wow. Tough stuff. Thankfully, we have a relatively calm week up and down the East Coast now. That is John Bernier, one of the best on the air in Virginia. You can find him at WRIC in Richmond. John, we'll talk to you down the road. Thanks so much for everyone who has been emailing your questions on both Twitter and Facebook. I got one here. Let me pull it up. This is from Bevins. And they are asking, is it true that seas are rising off the coast in North Carolina? And really, it's all up and down the East Coast. The statistic, the most recent one that I saw was going back to 1950. It is estimated that, and again, you know how the coast fluctuates, so you have to kind of spread out an average. It's estimated since 1950, the water along our coast has come up 11 inches. And here we are almost 2019, 2020, so we're talking almost 70 years, it's come up about a foot. We're going to talk a little bit more in just a few minutes we're going to go down to Savannah, Georgia, and talk specifically about some coastal issues. But I want to kind of remind everyone where we are. I mentioned earlier that it's almost July, meaning we have got through the month of June without any tropical activity. We don't see anything coming in the next few days, and July starts on Monday. So as we look at kind of our graph of tropical activity throughout the year, obviously as we go through the middle and end of summer, tropical activity, the amount of storms we see ramps up. And then as we go toward the end of the year, things start to calm down. Well, remember, we are right here, so we still have a long way to go. Even though we're almost a month in, we still have a long way to go. But here's something interesting and something we'd expect to see this time of year. And this is a graph. I know it's a line graph, and that might make some of your heads hurt. I know back in some of my classes I did too. But this is sea surface temperature. This is ocean temperature anomaly, meaning how much warmer than average, how much cooler than average are things. And if you take the center line, which is right here where my hand is, any blue line above that center line is warmer than average, and you can see it fluctuates. This goes all the way back to April. What I want to point out is, and what's interesting to us, because remember, you need warm water to get a hurricane to form. Well, where the most recent observation was taken is higher than any point it's been this year. And again, that's no surprise, but that again is proof that as we go into July and the rest of the hurricane season, those warmer than average sea surface temperatures are going to help to promote some tropical activity. And one thing we hear a lot of is when storms are approaching that they're too weak to cause any massive damage. I just ran across some interesting numbers in the past couple of days. When you consider all Category 1 hurricanes to impact the United States since 2010, so almost a decade's worth of Category 1 only, those Category 1 storms have resulted in 175 deaths with over $100 billion in damage. So this is a great example of why it's never okay just to assume that whether it's a depression, a storm, or just a Category 1 hurricane, that it's not something you need to worry about. You need to focus on the overall hazards and not read the headline of a Category 1 hurricane. And before we head down to our next guest, I want to remind everyone that only 2% of tropical activity happens in June. The most common months where things really get busy are August, September, and early October. So those months are ahead. Of course, the summer months are coming. I know a lot of you are already spending some time on vacation. Maybe you headed to one of these spots. Let's take a live look down at Tybee Island, Georgia. This is just outside Savannah. And with us from Savannah, Georgia, is the WSAV Chief Meteorologist, Chris Aldred. Hi, Chris. What we really want to talk to you about, I mentioned it earlier, was coastal flooding. But what we're probably not supposed to talk about is our favorite food items at Paula Deen's restaurant there in Savannah, the Lady and Son. I've been a few times. Maybe we can do a whole nother show on that. But talk to us about, you guys are 10, 15 miles from the coast. They're at your TV station. Flooding is an issue here in Raleigh from rain from the sky, but you guys got rain from the sky and you got ocean water rising. How do you all deal with coastal flooding when hurricanes are approaching?
All right. Well, first of all, good evening to everybody out there. Yeah, a couple topics that I wanted to talk about tonight, storm surge and coastal flooding. First of all, storm surge is critical because it is responsible for the majority of the fatalities when a hurricane hits. Usually it's about 40%. And that's the reason why you probably have heard the expression, you hide from the wind, but you run from the water. That's why we're told to evacuate when these storms hit. And when they tell you to evacuate, you need to. But let's talk about coastal flooding for a second. And I want to take a live view of our Tybee Cam. This is Bull River Bridge that you are looking at right now, and you're looking live. That is Highway 80. That is the only road that we have going on and off of Tybee Island. So when water is covering this highway, you can't get off the island, you can't get onto it. And this doesn't just happen during a tropical storm or a hurricane. This happens on days when our high tide is so high that water covers the road, so kids can't go to school, people can't go to work, and if there is a medical emergency, you can't get to them either. So that's one of the reasons why we are talking so much about that tonight, because coastal flooding days, I have been here since 2007, so we're coming up on 12 years. It's happening more and more all the time. So let's take a look here with our graphics where Savannah is, because I know a lot of us are watching from all over the country. Savannah is right along the coast of Georgia, but our TV market, we cover about 18 counties. So up and down the coast of Georgia and South Carolina, roughly, we cover about 100 miles up and down the coast. But that's not the only thing with us. We have all this marshland, and if you look pretty closely, you see how it goes from a lighter color of land and it goes to darker? Well, where it's darker, that is our marshland. And when we have low tide, we are responsible for about 500,000 acres of marsh. Now think about that for a second. The water is very shallow. So when you do have tide where the water's coming in during high tide, or you have a tropical storm, or you have a hurricane, well, the water has nowhere to go except up and push farther inland. So when we get hit very hard, and flooding is our biggest issue. So this is an aerial view of what our marsh looks like. So you have all these creeks and you have rivers, you have all of that, not just along the coast, but you have it miles farther inland, even to the west of I-95, which is what we consider our inland areas. So let's take a look here, because what we do when the water does cover the road, most of the time it has to shut down. So what we're looking at right here, as I told you, I started working in 2007 in Savannah. This photo right here is from 2009. This is one of the first memories that I ever have where there was water over Highway 80, where people were actually freaking out. We had people calling up to the newsroom asking what was going on. Even my best friend, who works right here at the TV station, she called and she said, "Chris, I don't remember there being thunderstorms." And I laughed and I said, "Honey, that's not rain. That is actually the ocean water coming over parts of Highway 80. But people are still driving on and off." Well, then take a look here. This is actually what happened only a couple of years ago, back in 2015. This is the supermoon flooding. And if you look, this is Highway 80. It is completely covered in water. We had to shut down the highway for hours. It was actually 2 days where we had to do this. And this is not even from a storm. This is from the supermoon, and we had winds out of the east. And this is one of the worst flooding events we've ever had. It was actually in our top 3 events. So imagine, if you will, what did it look like when we did have a tropical storm or hurricane hit? Because we've been fairly active the last couple of years. I want you to take a look here at a live view of River Street. Actually, this is on Tybee. And this is actually good to start with this too, because if you take a look at the beach, if you ever have visited Tybee Island before, then you would know we're not known for our waves. We are known for our tides, of course, the big variation. Low tide's about 0 feet, and then on an average day, it's about 7 feet when it goes up to high tide. I grew up in Alabama, so we would go to the Gulf of Mexico. You put your beach chair down at the beach, and that's where you would sit. When you go out to Tybee, if you want to put your feet in the water, kind of put your chair right down by the edge, if you were going to stay about 4 or 5 hours during the day, you would have to move your chair repeatedly because the tide is such a huge, huge difference. And already we are aware of this. If you look here at this photo right here, we do have construction that's going on for Highway 80 at the moment. What they're doing is they're trying to raise the road by 8 inches, and it should be enough to where on most days where you do have that high tide flooding, the water is not going to cover the roadways. But we've already been told, even right now, raising it to 8 inches, that's probably only going to get us by for about 30 to 50 years if we are lucky. So when a storm system really does hit, we're taking a look here at Irma. This is the official forecast track. So if you remember, Irma hit during 2017. The storm system came up through parts of Florida. It then went through Georgia and Alabama. So we were over here. We were to the east of the storm system. And to be honest with you, we really didn't even get hit that hard. I think we had tropical storm force conditions, like winds up to about 65 miles per hour. But the problem is with Irma, it hit at the worst possible time. It hit during the middle of the day, and it hit during our high tides. And I want to show you this video right here. See if we can pull that up right now. All right, so the video that you're looking at right now, this is River Street, and the water has completely taken over. Even right there, this is where the Marriott Hotel is. Water got into the rooms where they have events, and you're right there on the water view. All of that had just amazing, just a lot of destruction and damage where they had to go in and deal with mold, and it took a while for the water to come back down. Next, we have video of what the storm surge looked like when it did hit Tybee. And again, that water went right over parts of the roads on Tybee Island. Many areas had a storm surge of about 5 feet, but we had swells up to about 15 feet. And again, this was a tropical storm for us, and we weren't even that close to the center of the storm system. So let me show you this too, because when we cover our area, a lot of our viewers are like, well, I live so far away from the coast, I don't need to evacuate. Well, here's an example of why this is such a huge difference for us. Richmond Hill. This is just the south of Savannah. It's in a county named Bryan County, and give or take, it's about 15 miles away from the direct coast. A lot of people live right along a river called Ogeechee River, and it also flooded during Irma, big time. So this is a viewer that sent us a photo of what his property looks like right along the river during a typical high tide event. And then the bottom of it is what it looked like when Irma moved in. So we see flooding, not just along the coast, but farther inland. And this is going to be something that we will have to deal with from here on out, whether it's just a normal coastal flooding event day with high tides, or if it is a tropical storm or a hurricane. Because from here on out, we are just very, very vulnerable. Our shores are so shallow, the water has to go somewhere, and it does move in, it takes over, and it can be very destructive, and it could even be deadly.
Wow, you know, sometimes I miss not living on the coast, but then I see pictures like that and it can be a little scary. You know, we just got a viewer question asking about sea level rise, and we talked about how it's come up in the past 70 years in North Carolina. How has global climate change and rising sea levels impacted you guys in Savannah?
Well, you know, we actually just did a story and did some research on this, and that is the reason why Highway 80, all the construction is going on now, where they are raising it up 8 inches. We have had so many more coastal flooding days in comparison with the studies that go back to the 1950s. And what we have been told is there's really not that much more you can do for the outcome of the next 100 years. Damage is done. Now we have to think of what we do next. But what we can do on a personal level is to reduce, reuse, and recycle. So to do that on an individual basis, that is where we stand right now. And then now we take those next steps of how we are going to protect our shorelines in the years to come. But right now, unfortunately, damage is done, and the only thing that we can do, got to raise that highway. And honestly, some of our islands, well, eventually they will be covered underwater, right. And our shoreline is going to change.
Wow. You showed that graphic, 15 miles. You guys are even closer than that to the coast at the TV station. So how do y'all handle when you have a flooding hurricane coming to your station? You got people still working, you're there working, covering the storm. How do you guys handle that when you're probably in a direct impact zone?
Well, just as you said before, every single storm is different. So first of all, you have to look at what is this storm going to do for me? Because when Matthew hit us in 2016, we had to decide, what are we going to do? Are we going to leave or are we going to stay? Well, in our situation, we decided to leave half of the crew here in Savannah, and we sent the other half to Statesboro, which is much farther inland, to Georgia Southern University. That way, if our station did get hit hard enough, we still had a crew to provide all of the information and coverage that they needed to. And that was a decision that Kyle Dennis and I had to make about 24 hours out. You're talking about pressure here because right. Even though I've been here since 2007, Savannah had not been hit really by a hurricane since 1979. So it was new for all of us, and we were sitting around trying to decide, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? So in that situation, we divided half the crew. Now, Savannah is so vulnerable. If we have a really bad storm system coming, we're going to leave. We're going to go to Statesboro to make sure that all of us are safe and that we can still provide coverage.
Wow. Yeah, you don't think about that. You know, we're always on TV covering bad storms, whether it's tornadoes, hurricanes, or snow events. And, you know, sometimes it's bad enough where we've got to move. So hopefully you don't have that situation anytime soon. Chris, it's always good to talk to you. Again, she is at WSAV. That's Chris Aldred in Savannah, Georgia. Check her out if you're ever down there vacationing. And she even gave you a great spot to pick out on the beach for your vacation this summer. All right, well, that's it for us. It is almost 8:30 on Wednesday night. I want to thank you for joining us for tonight's Eye on the Storm. Don't forget, we're going to be here every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock throughout the Atlantic hurricane season. They even let me sit down tonight. So thank you for spending part of your night with us. Live in Raleigh, North Carolina, I'm Wes Hohenstein.